So if you look at the long-term impacts of what is happening in Ukraine, you're starting to see the beginnings of a really reshifted world order. So first of all, the Europeans are now actually going to rearm. The Europeans have decided that they are going to get tough, that they are no longer going to engage in the delusion where Greta Thunberg actually ran their foreign policy. They're not going to do that any longer. European Parliament announced this morning that they've now accepted Ukraine's application to join the European Union. A special admission procedure has now begun. So Ukraine is now going to be joined into the EU. Meanwhile, you've seen Germany completely U-turning on its entire perspective on foreign policy, according to DNYUZ.com. It took an invasion of a sovereign country nearby, threats of nuclear attack, images of civilians facing off against Russian tanks, and a spate of shaming from allies for Germany to shake its decades-long faith in a military-averse foreign policy that was born of the crimes of the Third Reich. But once Chancellor Olaf Scholz decided to act, the country's about-face was swift. February 24th, 2022 marks a historic turning point in the history of our continent, said Scholz. He's announced that Germany would increase its military spending to more than 2% of the country's economic output, beginning immediately with the one-off 100 billion euros or $113 billion to invest in the country's woefully under-equipped armed forces. He added that Germany would speed up construction of 2 terminals for receiving liquefied natural gas, part of efforts to ease the country's reliance on Russian energy. He said at the heart of the matter is the question of whether power can break the law, whether we allow Putin to turn back the hands of time to the days of the great powers of the 19th century, or whether we find it within ourselves to set limits on a warmonger like Putin. The events of the past week have shocked countries with typically pacifist means, as well as those more closely aligned with Russia. Both have found the invasion impossible to watch quietly. Viktor Orban, the generally pro-Russia anti-immigrant prime minister of Hungary, who denounced sanctions against Russia just weeks ago, reversed his position this weekend. Japan, which was hesitant to impose sanctions on Russia in 2014, strongly condemned last week's invasion. Well, the reason they did that is because they're looking across the water and they see China right there. In fact, the former prime minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, he came out and he said that perhaps Japan should consider hosting American nuclear weapons on their soil, which is a massive reversal. So what we're about to see, primarily when it comes to hard power, is a real military buildup that's going to happen from all of our erstwhile allies. Now, that's all fun and games until the point at which one of those erstwhile allies becomes a not ally. It turns out that a wildly rearmed world, as opposed to an American-dominated world, is a much more dangerous world, because the fact is that countries have differential interests, and countries are more likely to get into armed conflict when they are armed. And so the fact that the United States was sort of the global police person, the United States was the world's global police force, we may not have wanted that role, but in the absence of that role, what you end up with is everybody fighting with each other. When the teacher leaves the room, the students begin fighting with one another. That's just the way the world works. And so we may be celebrating the fact that Germany is now paying 2% of its GDP for its budget. And that's good. It is. I mean, they should be increasing their military budget to pay for NATO forces. All of that is correct. I mean, President Trump encouraged them to do that. But the sort of newly nationalistic fervor that you're starting to see in Europe, that has a sort of nasty history, does it not? It turns out that the alternative to an American organized global order is a non-organized disorder. Russia and China, meanwhile, have been moving closer together. So China came out yesterday. They said they don't like economic sanctions. China is looking at Taiwan. China and Russia are banding closer together with Iran. Meanwhile, Finland and Sweden are now moving to join NATO as well. So you're starting to see more and more countries in Europe sort of solidify as part of this broader Western alliance. So is that a new Cold War, or is that more like just a series of discombobulated countries all seeking, by the way, nuclear weapons? If you're a non-aligned country, if you're not formally aligned with either one, you're not a member of the EU, but you're also not a member of the China-Russia axis, and there are no mutual defense guarantees, aren't you seeking a nuclear weapon? Are you doing that like right now? There's a reason, for example, that Israel sought a nuclear weapon in the 1960s. It was a non-aligned country, and the idea was that if it was invaded, last-ditch scenario, they were going to nuke somebody. In fact, Golda Meir, the prime minister of Israel, apparently in 1973, she basically said to the United States, when the United States was not sending material support, she said, listen, if you don't send us bullets and we are down to our last man, then the nukes go off. And the United States is like, okay, fine, well, I guess we'll send you some bullets so you can defend yourself in the Yom Kippur War. But the simple fact of the matter is that non-aligned countries are going to rearm. You're going to start seeing more and more countries looking for nuclear weapons. So the sort of era of widespread peace is coming to an end. And it's coming to an end because the West had bought into a delusion, and that delusion was the Thomas Friedman, Francis Fukuyama delusion that we had reached the end of history. And we decided to turtle. We decided to ostrich our heads for 3 decades. And any time a conflict arose, the idea was it was an exception to the rule. The rule is not a more violent world in which people fight each other and have differential interests and different cultures, look for different borders and all the rest. Instead, we were going to say that we were moving toward a grand idealistic enterprise in which all economies were interrelated. And as Thomas Friedman suggested in The Lexus and the Olive Tree, the Golden Arches theory, if everybody had a McDonald's, then nobody would fight. And it turns out that all of that was nonsense. It wasn't true. And so the West turtled. And now Vladimir Putin has shaken the West out of that feeling. Well, I'm glad that the West has been shaken awake. I'm a little bit concerned about the effects of a West that already has abandoned the idea of American hegemony, which was the guarantor of world peace, really since the end of World War II. Meanwhile, by the way, inflation is spiraling out of control, and there are going to be some real costs in the West for that. According to the Wall Street Journal, rising inflation is driving up expenses for many large U.S. pension funds that have promised retirees cost of living raises. So for all those who think that foreign policy doesn't matter, just understand life is about to get a lot more expensive because we didn't take the preventative measures necessary to keep America at the top of the world order. Foreign policy, just like domestic policy, has consequences. Who's got two thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?